So right now we have this endless drama surrounding deplatforming, free speech, creator infighting, from the Quartering versus Kino Casino to Otterly Noah's DMCA incidents to EFAP's treatment of Synthetic Man. This is simply Reddit culture with better production values and a monetization layer. On Reddit, the mechanics are all familiar to this. An anonymous hive mind enforces ever-shifting norms through upvotes, downvotes, reports, subreddit bans, and speech is only free until it violates the current consensus of the subreddit. Dissenters are not debated with, they are disappeared. The anti-woke YouTube, the streaming sphere, it all operates on nearly identical principles, just with faces, with voiceovers, and with super chats attached to it. The selective free speech rhetoric follows the same pattern here. Centrist libertarian influencers champion it loudly when their own side is targeted, then quietly endorse or actively participate in reporting, in flagging, in copyright strikes, or audience pile-ons when a rival steps out of line. It's all tribal preference enforcement wearing the mask of principle. And this is, by the way, why the broader anti-woke project in its current form feels so hollow and doomed. Most of these influencers refuse any collective identity beyond that of discerning consumers of product. Their critique rarely goes beyond, this is bad writing, and go woke, go broke, and bring back the escapism. They avoid serious politics, any deeper cultural diagnosis, or any discussion about what media should be. To go there would require invoking Christianity, traditional principles, or some positive vision of human flourishing. No, instead, they offer surface-level outrage and gatekeep anyone who tries to move the Overton window into a more substantive direction. And in doing so, they just replicate a Reddit-like dynamic. Endless consumption of content, moral signaling through complaints, and suppression of voices that threaten the comfortable niche they've carved out. And progressives win by default here because they possess a coherent, if corrosive, ideological vision and a collective identity. The current anti-woke commentary sphere mostly just performs discontent while guarding its slice of the limited attention economy.
If you're familiar with the history of the YouTuber Synthetic Man, you should note that in late 2022, shortly after the release of God of War Ragnarok, Synthetic Man published a sharply negative review entitled God of War Ragnarok is not a masterpiece. Days later, the YouTube podcast known as EFAP posted episode number 217 in December of 2022, where the panel watched an extended supercut of Synthetic Man's review and his gameplay streams, offering both real-time reactions and roasting. Shortly afterwards, Mahler also uploaded a roughly 4-hour video bearing the inflammatory title, Synthetic Man, the grotesque, grifting goblin clown forever thirsting for attention. This video compiled long stretches of clips from Synthetic Man's streams with zero narration from Mahler, and the video was also very selectively edited and ordered, and the title itself was also used to portray Synthetic Man in a negative light. Notably, Mahler retained segments in which Synthetic Man used some slurs and made other edgy or potentially terms of service risky comments. Content that Mahler and his panel knew could be viewed as distasteful or flag-worthy on YouTube. And of course, these clips were kept so that viewers would be fully aware of what Synthetic Man had said during these streams, using his own words and behavior as evidence of what may have been regarded as poor character. Now, I bring all this up because recently there was a smaller YouTube commentator named Otterly Noah who filed, or more precisely guided his artist to file, a false DMCA or copyright strike against another creator named Callisto. And this is after Callisto had created a critical video talking about Otterly Noah's plagiarism and related issues. Otterly Noah's artist, the one who creates his PNG tuber Otter avatar artwork, issued the copyright strike on that critical video. Evidence, including leaked DMs, statements, and admissions, showed that Noah coached the artist step by step on how to file the DMCA claim, including providing information about the thumbnail or other assets to target. Now, Noah would later admit his involvement, and he justified it by claiming that the video critical of him was racist, or it contained racist elements. He basically said it was a false or improper strike, but it was motivated by that perception rather than a legitimate copyright infringement. And so with blood in the water, EFAP number 384 covered this drama, with the panel reacting to Noah's flip-flopping explanations and admissions. They branded Noah a pathetic plagiarist and compared him to James Somerton, and strongly condemned the use of copyright tools to suppress critics, insisting that legitimate disagreement should be met with better arguments in the open marketplace of ideas, rather than platform enforcement mechanisms. Now, hopefully you're already beginning to see the hypocrisy in how EFAP applies standards of criticism and accountability. Because in Synthetic Man's case, Mahler and EFAP could not pursue such straightforward suppression tactics that the panel would later use to condemn Otterly Noah. Instead, as we know, what Mahler had done in 2022 was make a 4-hour supercut that more or less served as an indirect alternative, a deliberate, lengthy compilation that spotlighted Synthetic Man using slurs, using TOS risky comments, all things that would very likely draw YouTube scrutiny, or mass reports. And by retaining and structuring those moments so prominently within the video, with the inflammatory title doing the rest of the rhetorical work, the video did function as an obvious ploy to make Synthetic Man's edgy behavior impossible to ignore. I mean, why else would you compile hours of raw footage specifically to highlight content that would get a channel flagged or demonetized, if not to invite viewers and potentially enforcers to notice and act on these distasteful elements? And if you do, you know you're being intellectually dishonest. You know that you're pretending like you don't understand anything just to frustrate any meaningful discourse about this. The irony deepens when one considers that EFAP's approach here appears to treat edgy or offensive speech as a legitimate weapon against critics they dislike. But didn't Otterly Noah say he was acting against perceived racism? Point being, if Mahler and the panel had no real problem with Synthetic Man's slurs and his edgy comments on their own merits, why would they deliberately set him up for potential reports and backlash by making those moments the centerpiece of an hours-long supercut? He clipped Synthetic Man to damage his reputation because Synthetic Man made a review that hit a little too close to home. Yet we also know that Mahler has a now-deleted tweet in which he called Joseph Anderson a massive faggot. And also in criticizing Joseph Anderson's review of Soma, he straight up used the word there as well. Now, the greater point of my video here is to point out that when YouTubers talk about just how shameful it is to undermine or neutralize opposing voices in the same digital ecosystem, the objective is to undermine or neutralize opposing voices in the same digital ecosystem. As the saying goes, there are no bad tactics. There's only bad targets. This is also why when it comes to deplatforming discussions today, such as the recent Quartering and Kino Casino feud, involving mass reporting and clip channel terminations, one should really care less about who says who wants to champion free speech. Because when criticism does hit too close to home, the responses from these people resemble the same thin-skinned tactics that they regularly condemn. It is crazy that anyone is taking discussions about deplatforming and free speech seriously here, considering there's a plethora of people, such as alt-right commentators of the past, whose speech was not supported nor championed, and have long since been removed from the platform. Incidentally, this is why all this talk of free speech is garbage. It's nonsense, because in the end, it all becomes selectively applied anyway. Throughout YouTube, there is zero moral consistency, much less the internet in general. There's only people who use the semblance of morality to manipulate their audiences into removing channels and commentators that are deemed distasteful. Now, something else worth disclosing here is that I do believe the Quartering is a grifter. I mean, judging from what the channel BobVid said about him 6 years ago, the Quartering's core demographic were disillusioned young to middle-aged men who have felt alienated by changes in modern AAA gaming and entertainment. And throughout the past decade, we've seen that any content that criticizes woke characters, woke storytelling, girl boss leads, or forced diversity, it all appeals to young men who claim that they prefer the classic power fantasies, the attractive female designs, and video games that focused on, well, gameplay experiences over political virtue signaling. But grifters are people who, regardless of how they actually feel about any of these matters, and regardless of how much they research these matters, could at least give themselves the semblance of appearing as though they were culturally right-leaning or classically liberal on social issues. They say they oppose oppose DEI initiatives. They oppose Sweet Baby Inc. style consulting and progressive female protagonists. And this is the audience for creators like The Quartering, but also like Nerdrotic, like Geeks and Gamers, and parts of the EFAP orbit, and all these other fandom menace, anti-SJW, or anti-woke channels. All these thumbnails with angry reactions to female characters and progressive politics are proven clickbait for this group because they tap into the loss of their primary hobby space. Creators like The Critical Drinker have turned the message into a literal catchphrase. When he and others say it, it functions as a polite euphemism for ham-fisted, progressive, identity politics messaging. It's the shoehorning of diverse character traits as the main personality of characters, and replacing entertainment with a bunch of political virtue signaling. It's never just bad writing in a vacuum. The implication is always that the writing is bad because the creators prioritized ideological goals over story, over characters, over fun. And we know that EFAP or Mahler hammer on craft issues, pacing, contradictions, objective versus subjective flaws, message-first storytelling, all the while explicitly steering clear of these deeper political analyses. And what happens with this vague framing is it lets their audiences nod along to the bad writing and the message without feeling like they're being recruited into any explicit partisan combat. In effect, this means the core demographic for these channels are people who are engaged in the same learned helplessness that actually ensures that the progressive types never cede their ground.
Not only does this approach ensure that progressives never have to cede any real ground, but for all intents and purposes, this functions as proto-wokeness. These people continually court the same wokeness they ostensibly oppose, all as a point of maintaining some semblance of white guilt-induced liberal tolerance. At the same time, their grift posits them as desperate to keep the logical conclusions of these courted progressive ideologies at bay. In fact, this is why the entire anti-woke project on every level is doomed to fail. It's the same reason why every Gamergate has failed, and why every future one will fail. The reason is simple. None of these influencers ever assert any collective identity apart from being consumers of product. In fact, most of them avoid talking about politics in any serious way, and even when they do, it stays surface level and pitched to the lowest common denominator. But the deeper failure lies in the underlying acceptance that we have no collective identity beyond what we consume. The vehemence toward how these products have changed is directed at the changes themselves, rather than what motivated those changes in the first place, and moreover, what ought to motivate them instead. The fact of the matter is, media was never primarily about escapism in the first place. What it once proffered was a way to live. Of course, the reason few, if any, of these influencers ever go there in any meaningful sense is that would require talking about Christianity, or at least Christian principles. Now instead they all hide behind vague and presumptuous language, allowing themselves to be corralled by YouTube and other platforms, and interestingly, they actively gatekeep anyone else who tries to shift the Overton window in any way, shape, or form. Hence why many of these influencers deserve to be called controlled opposition. When the critique stops at surface-level symptoms and never really grapples with the ideological engine driving those decisions, it all really starts to feel like it's purely performative. They're harvesting the cultural discontent without paying the full price of naming any of the underlying problems. And that gap is why grift charges stick so easily. It looks like they're selling the feeling of pushback while carefully avoiding anything that might shrink their audience or invite real consequence. And while some in this space may go harder and take more heat, others stay comfortably in the euphemism zone. But here's the thing. Nerdrotic and a large chunk of the anti-woke commentary sphere, including parts of the EFAP orbit, have been permitted to operate for years on YouTube precisely because their output, at its core, functions as managed discontent. In other words, it's all loud, it's all entertaining, and it's all emotionally satisfying. And it keeps the audience engaged. It keeps them subscribed
and it keeps them donating. All the while, rarely translating into anything that meaningfully disrupts the system that they are complaining about. YouTube, which is a subsidiary of Google and largely progressive, allows this kind of rhetoric in its current state because engagement farming is still profitable. Rage, nostalgia, and all the endless "they're ruining our video games" content drives watch time, it drives comments, and it drives shares. Google, YouTube, they don't mind monetizing this outrage as long as it stays within acceptable bounds and it doesn't spill into anything that is organized, anything that might be considered effective pushback. Comfortable helplessness sells. And the typical formula is as follows. Show the latest woke trailer, character design, decision, movie, whatever it is. Mock it. Break down why it's bad. The message, the terrible writing, the ugly character models, etc. And then end with some version of "this is why everything sucks now," and "go woke, go broke," even when the financial data is mixed at best. And repeat this next week. And this creates a cycle where viewers feel seen and validated in their frustrations, but nobody is ever given or encouraged toward anything concrete. There are no sustained strategies that would actually hurt the target companies. Instead, it's often just "wait for the box office to flop" or "vote with your wallet" as a slogan. Well, many in the audience still keep pre-ordering, they keep buying their season passes, and they keep giving money to Disney, to Activision, or whomever. This is all comfortable, learned helplessness. You get to feel like a rebel for watching a 20 to 40 minute video calling something mid or woke garbage, but the studios just keep on making more of this stuff. And the ideology keeps advancing in the next project, and the influencers keep getting paid. This is exactly why the grift accusation lands so hard. The creators aren't stupid. Many of them understand the deeper ideological capture, HR departments, activist consultants, risk-averse executives, cultural signaling, but explicitly naming and fighting the political engine behind all this comes with its own risks. And this loops back perfectly with the EFAP, Synthetic Man, Otterly Noah territory I've been discussing. EFAP's careful, craft-focused dissections and Mahler's supercut tactics were part of the same ecosystem. They channel real discontent into entertaining, low-risk content. It feels like resistance, but it never builds into actual power. And that's why, even though I think Otterly Noah was wrong for his copyright striking, he would have fared far better off if he just told the people who criticized him that he had no obligation to explain his actions to them. And then there's Synthetic Man's critique of God of War Ragnarok. His review carried more direct substance than the vague bad writing and the message euphemisms commonly used in the creator space. Synthetic Man explicitly called out what he saw as woke feminist influences, particularly in Freya's portrayal, the lazy sequel storytelling, and the ideological priorities that overrode the entertainment value of the game. And yet all his forthrightness rewarded him with being effectively blacklisted by many in the broader commentary community. And this reaction suggests that many of these creators do not truly oppose the progressive leanings in media. They simply want them to be delivered in a more balanced or palatable or centrist libertarian framed package that maintains the appearance of objectivity while avoiding raw ideological confrontation. Unless you think this is some kind of a conspiracy going on, it's not. Grift is such a perfect label because it implies there's an incentive structure, because outrage without any agency behind it is highly monetizable, whereas real agency is risky for everyone involved. So EFAP condemns Otterly Noah for using platform tools to suppress criticism, while 4 years ago, EFAP's own response to Synthetic Man relied on similar, if indirect, tactics. In that same vein, all their media criticisms dance around the political motivations of whomever is making these works, while loudly defending rigorous analysis. All this is engaging the problem just enough to ride the wave, but not enough to risk alienating the broader or more skittish parts of their audience. This is why I dare say Otterly Noah should have simply stood his ground, doubled down on his decision. Even if one fundamentally agrees with the filing of a false DMCA, as I do, the smarter move would have been to own it openly as a matter matter of defending his own personal preferences, rather than folding to the preferences of the crowd that came after him. Because what these discussions desperately need, but rarely ever reach, is an honest examination of where these supposed principles actually come from and why anyone is obligated to abide by them in the first place. Seriously, what is EFAP going to do? What is anyone else going to do? Nothing. They can't do anything. They're just going to sit in their panels and complain, but nothing will change. The same principle should apply to the quartering, by the way. Own what you did outright. State clearly that the Kino Casino deserved to be deplatformed and stand firm on that position. And what's the worst that can happen? That some angsty Redditors or YouTubers are going to write something scathing about you? Well, try to live with the disappointment. There are way too many people in this discussion who talk about free speech as existing under the terms set down by these centrist libertarian types. You know, an expansive cultural expectation that private individuals and platforms should platform everyone and face no consequences, right? It's a myth. The reality is that everyone ultimately does curtail speech they personally find distasteful, and they will rally their audience around those boundaries. And that's why this entire discourse surrounding these events just feels so untrustworthy. None of this is about any objective principles. It's just one tribal force arrayed against another. People angry about the Kino Casino being displaced aren't really upset about free speech. They're upset that someone they found entertaining was deplatformed by someone else that they dislike, for reasons that may or may not be legitimate. And what did the quartering do that was so bad? It was attempt to quell a rival's influence. What Otterly Noah did was attempt to quell influence. And what Mahler and EFAP tried to do with the Synthetic Man supercut was also an attempt to quell influence. That is the dirty secret. These creators don't actually want to share the same platform with competitors or with people that they find distasteful. That's it. There is no objective underlying principle to any of this. Ultimately, all this hand-wringing over deplatforming is an outcropping of a more fundamental problem that every influencer in the digital space must confront: a limited audience. As Joshua Moon of the Kiwi Farms had observed back in 2023, there's a finite supply of other people's money to capture. And in a saturated attention economy, creators will, periodically, turn on each other in purity spirals, all in an attempt to score points within their partisan supporter bases through selective outrage and calls for enforcement. The quartering Kino Casino drama, the Otterly Noah saga, and the EFAP response to Synthetic Man are all textbook examples of this. This is not and never has been primarily about free speech. If it were, we would have seen consistent, principled support from these same voices for the many creators who have been truly deplatformed over the years, regardless of whether their views were aligned with the in-group. Instead, the pattern reveals tribal resource competition all dressed up as principle.